Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GAROP Global Alliance of the Rights of Older People webinar series. This webinar today, we are having on the very important topic of learning from civil society engagement in other international human rights processes. This is a part of a series of webinars that we are hosting in order to strengthen awareness and understanding of human rights of older persons, and most importantly, how civil society organizations can best engage with their governments in order to, in particular, achieve a convention of the human rights for older persons, but more broadly, to make sure that the older person's human rights are protected, respected, and crucially get implemented. We're very privileged to have with us on this webinar two very prominent people who have had enormous influence in their respective areas of work. I will introduce each of them in turn, but just to say that we have with us Tina Minkowitz and Fergus Ara Begum. What I'd like to begin with, though, is first explaining the structure of what we will do with the webinar, but also making sure that people are aware of the broader context in which this discussion is taking place. In that respect, there are two things that are crucial that we highlight today. The first is that the UN has taken the step to curtail the open-ended working group's 11th session. It is cancelled all of the side events, all of the public meetings, and instead has reduced the agenda to only a few hours of including for just New York delegations. This is, of course, due to the impact that the COVID-19, the new coronavirus, is having on the world as we speak. This does not mean that the discussion we're having today is less important. If anything, it is more important because the impact of coronavirus has shown how important it is for us to increase the visibility of the human rights of older persons. We have seen, no matter where we are in the globe, that the groups that are most affected, that are most at risk of mortality from the coronavirus, are older persons and people who have underlying health conditions. But we are also seeing very worryingly that those people who are most at risk, in particular older persons, are being denied access to the health and to the support that they need. And indeed, the potential that the measures that are being put in place in order to mitigate the further spread of the virus may further isolate, may create situations that actually put those people, older people, even at greater risk. So these are very real topics we're talking about, protecting the rights of older persons. It's an issue that we have to deal with today. We will come to what we can do next at the end of this webinar in terms of next steps. But first, of course, we have the privilege of hearing from our two speakers. So we can learn from their experience, both in the area of achieving a convention on the rights of people with disabilities in the case of Tina, and in influencing and creating a general recommendation for the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against all forms of discrimination against women, and the specific recommendation on the rights of older women that Fergus was deeply involved with. The way the webinar is going to function is that each speaker will speak for 10 minutes. We will not have any time in between for question and answers, but we will set aside at least a half an hour in which you can have your questions responded to by the speakers. The way to post questions is through the question and answer function that you see on the webinar page in front of you. Please do not use the chat function. We will only be answering questions that are posted through the question and answer box. So that is our introduction. And what I'd like to do now is to move to Tina and introduce Tina properly. Tina Minkowitz, our first speaker, represented the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry in the drafting and negotiation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. She served on the steering committee of the International Disability Caucus and was a member of the 40-person drafting group that created the official text of the treaty for negotiation. She is credited with much of the paradigm-shifting character of CRPD in the areas of legal capacity, liberty, and respect for integrity of the person. And we are really grateful that Tina is giving us her time so we can understand better what we can do as on the rights of older persons and engaging within the US space to learn the lessons that the disability movement have learned in creating the convention. So Tina, I'm handing the floor over to you. 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And I should see my slides up on the screen shortly. The slogan of the disabled people's organizations, DPOs, in the CRPD negotiations was "Nothing about us without us." And that was a very affirmative and proactive stance. We were the protagonists. We owned this convention. This was about us, and we had a huge influence on it. Next slide, please. So Ken already told you about my experience. I will just say that the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry was one of the core DPOs involved in that process, participating very actively, and that it was a transformative experience for me, both personally and politically. Next slide. So how did we organize? I think we had a great advantage that we started with a nucleus that had already existed of the International Disability Alliance of 7 global disability organizations, of which most of them were DPOs. Most of them were organizations of people with disabilities with a representative structure. So it had a high degree of representativity and that kind of democratic legitimation in the process. IDA was predominantly constituency based because many segments of the disability community had simply organized, on their own. There was one cross-disability organization, Disabled Peoples International, but we had the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, which I represented. We had the World Blind Union, the World Federation of the Deaf, etc. So to create an international disability caucus for purpose of the negotiations that would be a wider body, we created a steering committee. So that was based on the 7 global organizations in IDA, to which we added regional constituencies. There was already a federation in Europe, and each region had a seat on the steering committee. Of DPOs, we had allied NGOs that were committed to the process, of which a few were strong enough that they made it onto the steering committee. A seat for women with disabilities, Indigenous people with disabilities. We kept adding anytime it was clear that there was a constituency that was not yet represented that needed to be. The IDC was open to all disabled people's organizations, all people with disabilities on government delegations, and any allied NGOs based on the principle of DPO leadership. So, and that principle was really constituency based. If any issue belonged to the people whose rights were directly affected by it. So if it was, you know, any issue about the rights of people with disabilities, that's what the whole negotiation, the whole drafting of the convention was about. If you're not a DPO, if you're not a person with disability, you're going to respect the position put forward by those who are. If you are not a blind person, you're going to respect the position put forward on Braille by the World Blind Union. So the steering committee members, eventually we created a structure where we had working groups in topic areas. Those were led by members of the steering committee that allowed everybody to focus their energy on the issues most important to them, and then the steering committee as a whole would have the final say. So the steering committee as a whole had that final check, and each constituency could say if there was anything a little bit off that had to be changed, and allied NGOs played a supportive role. Next slide, please. How did we influence the outcome? One thing that, from my perspective, was really key was the creation of a drafting group that was similarly constituency based, that included both states chosen on a regional basis and also a large number of NGOs, 12 NGOs selected by the IDC. That number actually corresponded to the 7 global organizations and 5 regional seats. 1 national human rights institution was also included, and all of these delegations had an equal role, except that only the states facilitated informals. That was crucial for me in particular, representing the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, to have that platform where I not only could advance proposals, but I played a decision-making role equal to the other delegations, equal to state delegations, in forming a consensus together. Prior to that, many states, many NGOs as well as states submitted text proposals. And also prior to that drafting group, the NGOs on the drafting group, mostly DPOs, coalesced to learn and understand each other's positions. We had a 2 or 3 day meeting in person, and that was really important for us to be able to offer solidarity to each other. And it was critical in our being able to work together as a unified body in later stages. Next slide, please. Okay. In later stages of the ad hoc committee, as the negotiations proceeded, prior to each session, we submitted joint comments with our preferred text and arguments for that preferred text. We had a daily newsletter that reflected on the previous day and highlighted priorities for the day ahead. And there were other ways that we worked together that similarly, we had both formal and informal contact with states, and the people with disabilities on government delegations often played a critical role in bringing the DPO's position into state-to-state negotiations. That was very important at several points. Next slide, please. So what are the lessons that I would take from our experience? DPO leadership was present and strong from the beginning. So the leadership of those whose rights are directly affected, organized collectively, not just individual people with disabilities, but the collective knowledge and positions that we had developed within our organizations, often the organizations having a global structure based on constituency. That dictated the structure and functioning of civil society in relation to the process, so in relation to the states, and also in our internal relations, as I said. So we had this mutual respect for positions and a desire to be in solidarity with each other, understanding that we share some issues, and there are also some issues that belong to one constituency or another constituency, that everyone, those who weren't part of it, could support each other. And states needed us and respected our expertise, as well as respecting our political role in legitimizing the process and the outcome. And I'd say that was also it was a moral and political legitimating function that we gave to that process of creating a convention about our human rights. Next, having the concrete focus of an outcome in which we all had a stake promoted cooperation and win-win solutions based on mutual respect. That was true among the states and among civil society, and states and civil society really mutually influenced each other in that. We had our non-negotiables as DPOs, understanding that we were not the actual negotiating entities. We had our positions, and we discussed them with each other, what we wanted and what was a bottom line for us as individual constituencies and collectively, to say, yes, we accept, we embrace this text, or no, if something like this gets in the text, we are going to actually reject the convention and say, this is not ours, this is against us. And we exerted our influence collectively and in solidarity with each other when it was called for. There were times when there was a danger of something coming into the text that would have been against our human rights. We exerted our influence collectively to prevent it. And we were able to make creative solutions to any conflict or divergence of interest among DPOs, to have, you know, if there was a slightly different position on an issue, we worked to have language that reflected and respected, you know, allowed everyone to get their needs met, to get what they wanted out of the treaty. And to the extent, to a large extent, I'd say that characterized the negotiations of the states and the ways that we created the text collectively together with the states, or collaboratively with the states as a whole. So I haven't seen anything telling me my time was getting short or my time was up, but I'm done. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Tina, and indeed you're spot on time. So thank you so much. There's so much richness, depth, and detail in what you've said that I'm not going to comment on any of that now. There are questions already coming through for you, which we'll come back to. What I would remind people listening is two things. One is that this webinar, and I didn't mention this earlier, is being recorded and will be available on the GAROP website. So even if you missed something now, you will be able to go back and review this and to share it with others, indeed, who couldn't be on the webinar today. And the second is, please do use the Q&A, the question and answer function, to submit any questions that you might have. So we're going to move on now to our second speaker, who brings also an exceptionally rich and valuable perspective from a very different part of the UN. This is Ferdiz Arabegum. Ferdiz is a gender and aging issues specialist and a former member of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women Committee. In her previous career as a civil servant in Bangladesh, she was the first woman Director General of Bangladesh Television and the first female Commissioner of Taxes. She served as a board member of the Nobel Peace Prize winning Grameen Bank, and she is currently CEO of the Active Aging and Research Center in Dhaka. Among Ferdiz's achievements, she was very much involved in the drafting of the CEDAW General Recommendation 27, which specifically clarifies how CEDAW applies to women's rights in older age. Fergus, we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections that on your experience of working within the UN system, the human rights system, and what we can learn from that. So, Fergus, you have 10 minutes as well. Over to you.
Share my experiences on the preparation of General Recommendation number 27 on the older women and protection of their human rights of the CEDAW Convention, which was adopted in the year 2010, and I will also share the key lessons learned from this process. The General Recommendation number 27 on the rights of older women of CEDAW Convention is the only blanket protection strategy and guideline to secure the rights of older women at the country level. I was very much involved in this process as a CEDAW committee member. It was in the early 2008, the then High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Louise Arbour, visited CEDAW committee and inquired about the global situation of older women and asked how the committee members are dealing with the situation. Obviously, we didn't have much information about older women as neither NGOs nor state parties raised much concerns on older women. Only we had some research reports from HelpAge International which stated that in some African countries, older women face witchcraft acquisition, beating, and burned to death situations. In general, we knew that older women are the most vulnerable group who are mostly invisible in all policy engagement. Due to demographic dynamics, number of older women is increasing day by day, and they are living mostly as widows and dependent on the family. I have decided to work for this vulnerable group. The following day, I met Ms. Natalie Gordon at the UN cafeteria who was wearing a badge on older women. She introduced me with some NGOs and civil society members who worked on older women's rights. They are Ms. Susan Paul of Global Action on Aging, Ms. Judy Lear, the then chair of NGO Committee on Aging at the UN, Ms. Bridget Slip of HelpAge International, and other representatives from Day Panthers, AARP, IFA, etc. They said, quote, "We tried to include older women's issues in the CEDAW General Recommendation for the last 10 years, but could not be successful. You came in a guardian angel. If you would like to work on older women's issues, we will provide all support to you." That was the beginning. I have presented a small background paper on older women's rights to CEDAW committee meeting with an intention to include it in the list of CEDAW General Recommendation. The committee on the elimination of discrimination against women decided at its 42nd session in pursuance of Article number 21 of the Convention to adopt a new general recommendation on older women and protection of their human rights. At the CEDAW committee, we formed a working group, me as chair, on the rights of older women. From outside, NGOs provided all support to me. Our first exposure was a big success. CEDAW Secretariat, with the support of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, organized a big meeting at the UN building, comprising of NGOs, civil society members, UN entities, state parties, members of the Third Committee at the UN, and other stakeholders, including gender experts. It was a jam-packed meeting. We presented a concept note on the older women's rights at the meeting, which was drafted very carefully. NGOs provided facts and figures, technical support, and CEDAW working group worked on this. We presented a concept note to the CEDAW plenary session first and got acceptance. Then we presented it to the formal UN meeting and got very positive responses and good feedback. It was big news in the UN media, especially Ms. Louise Herman's UN Network News. Ms. Jane Connor's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights confirmed the support for a general recommendation on older women and affirmed that it looks forward to assisting the committee on this. The issue of discrimination against older women is one that is alive and continues to grow in significance. We have explained in the concept note that This new general recommendation on older women will explore the relationship between all the articles in the convention and aging. It will outline the content of the obligation assumed by the states as parties to the convention from the perspective of aging with dignity and older women's rights, as well as multiple forms of discrimination they face as they age. The general recommendation on older women will also include policy recommendations for mainstreaming the concerns of older women into national strategies and development initiatives so that older women can practice fully without discrimination and on the basis of equality. The proposed general recommendation will also provide guidance to both states parties and NGOs on the inclusion of older women's rights in their reporting. The general recommendation on older women would enable the committee to focus on specificities so that effective recommendations and guidance could be provided to the state parties. It would also give older women and their rights a greater visibility and priority among state parties, NGOs, and the wider human rights system. We worked from 2008 to 2010 relentlessly on the issue in the form of drafting, communication, and negotiation. CEDAW committee provided time in each session to have a meeting of the working group, which consisted of Ms. Yoko Hayashi from Japan, Ms. Neila Mohammed Gabor from Egypt, Ms. Sylvia Pimentel from Brazil, and few other members, and me as the chair of the working group. We made a thorough mapping of the issues concerned to the older women and collected inputs from different circles related to older women's rights. CEDAW working group was very careful about every wording and every sentence of the draft general recommendation. Ms. Bridget Sleep of Helpage International provided important inputs to the draft general recommendation of the older women. On November 6, 2009, we have organized a lunch meeting at the Palais des Nations, Geneva, which was attended by around 50 participants made up of CEDAW committee members, NGO representatives, and diplomats from Bangladesh, Japan, and other countries. Ms. Elizabeth Sclater of Grey Panthers and Older Women's Network Europe acted as the reporter and summarized the key points at the end of the meeting. Speakers from the CEDAW committee, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, NGOs, civil society members, and diplomats supported the contents of the new draft general recommendation from different perspectives. NGOs from New York came with big help. They provided bound-bag lunch and supported 2 experts to come to Geneva to attend the meeting. The question and answer session enabled participants to give an indication of some of the areas where the general recommendation would contribute to making a real difference to the lives of older women. In my welcome address, I have emphasized how older women experience aging differently to men, and that the discrimination older women experience is often intersectional. Their old age compounding other forms of discrimination based on gender, ethnic origin, disability, levels of poverty, or literacy. European committee members were unable to attend as they had another engagement. 2010 was the last year of my tenure as the CEDAW committee member. Our draft general recommendation on older women was at the final stage with support of the 180 NGOs globally. We are waiting for United Nations clear nod for adoption. The good news came on 10th October 2010 that United Nations adopted the general recommendation on older women and protection of their human rights. Thus, older women got an important protection strategy to secure their rights, dignity, well-being, and voice. So what lessons we learned from this whole process, which could be useful to open-ended working groups engagements? First, We need some dedicated and committed people within the UN system to support the causes of human rights. Number two, civil society engagement is the power of any movement, but we need support of the UN entities, state parties, foreign office, and diplomats of different countries attached to UN. We need strong lobbying power and capacity for negotiation in this area. Adequate knowledge base of human rights and statistical support are important tools for quality drafting process of human rights instruments. Civil society members and human rights experts can play an important role in this respect. Number four, sufficient resources support is essential to continue lobbying and negotiation at the UN and with the member states and continue movement at the national level. Number five, national level movements, sensitization and awareness creation among political leaders, decision makers are another important work of civil society members. Number six, media support are important to mobilize opinion in favor of the causes of human rights instruments. Thank you for your time. Hello.
Thank you so much for this. That was absolutely fascinating and a huge richness to your experience. We are starting to get questions coming through, so I'm just going to go straight in to some of the questions that have been appearing. And I'm going to start with a question that I had in my mind, but which was also asked by Francis, which is, for both you, Fergus, and Tina, and perhaps I'll turn to you, Fergus, first on this, is how did you deal with opposition in terms of what you were trying to achieve? That's the question, basically. What opposition did you face? Please you don't have to be detailed in describing the opposition. I think what we really want to hear about is how did you manage that? What lessons can you share with us about how to push back and how to overcome opposition?
Thank you very much. Actually, we got a little opposition from European Union, and but I think we got overwhelming support from all quarters. You know, NGOs, civil society members, UN bodies, um, um, and all, because this is a live issue. I mean, older women, they are suffering, they are invisible, they need support and they need protection strategy. So everybody supported me. That is why, I mean, though we didn't have, support from European Union, we got the general recommendation number 27.
Thank you. And Tina, how would you describe the situation?
Well, I would highlight 3 points at which we faced opposition and had to overcome it. One was to get to the point of actually convening the ad hoc committee itself before the UN was actually ready to make a resolution to have this process start. European Union countries had been proposing a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities for maybe a decade or even more beforehand, but hadn't been successful in winning support. Finally, Mexico was able to push through resolutions first at the World Conference Against Racism and then in the UN General Assembly, in which it appealed to the need to bring together the social development and human rights frameworks and to talk about inclusive development of the society, bringing people with disabilities into all of the rights-based and productive and constructive features of social participation. And that proved to be what actually gave us a majority of states really pushing for the convention. At the stage where we actually had to move to, okay, let's get down to drafting, there was still some opposition from the EU and from the US, probably some other countries. And at that point, lobbying individual, NGOs lobbying their countries proved to be really crucial in getting us to that decision. There was one final piece that I was directly involved in, where at the very end of the negotiations, a footnote got put into one of the really crucial articles, the article on legal capacity, that was a negative, a detriment, and would have really called into question the human rights that we were actually promoting. And civil society mobilized along with the states that was supporting us on this issue to get the footnote removed. We worked very closely in cooperation, the states, the friendly states, and civil society, including parliamentarians in some countries' own human rights experts, and civil society. We met with delegations in New York, and we were ultimately successful in getting that removed. So I think that's, yeah, that was a process I was directly involved in, and you do face opposition at every stage. I think one thing we found is eventually we were able to use opposition kind of as a springboard to get even further, and we're finding that with the opposition that still exists to some of the more innovative and groundbreaking aspects of the convention.
That's really helpful. I'm going to just follow up with you first, Tina, on a couple of points. There are a few questions that I think are directed specifically to you, and then Fergus, there's another set that I'll direct to you. You've answered this in part already. So there was a question from Francis Zainuddin about when the ad hoc committee was established, and you've already indicated it was established before the resolution to start drafting a convention, but specifically who led and chaired it. And I guess the underlying question is, what were the motivations? What was it that mobilized and catalyzed this committee to come together?
Okay, the ad hoc committee was our equivalent of the open-ended working group itself. The only difference was that the resolution, our resolution that established the ad hoc committee, was further along than the resolution for the open-ended working group, in that it specifically invited states to consider proposals for a convention. Okay, so there was that stage. That was the negotiations in the UN General Assembly, and what I discussed about Mexico really pushing that forward, and Mexico and got the G77 on board, and that's what really made it happen. And that had been pushed for by DPOs, particularly Latin American DPOs, and I wasn't involved. I don't have a lot of knowledge about how that was done. And then the decision to make a draft, to actually go ahead to make a drafting group, that was a decision that happened in the second meeting of the ad hoc committee. We had 8 sessions of the ad hoc committee in total, and plus the session of the working group. So, and that was over a period of 4 years. So our process had been a lot quicker, and states really didn't want to drag it out. Oh, and there was the individual named to chair the ad hoc committee at first was an ambassador of Ecuador, Luis Gallegos. Then there was the coordinator of the working group was Ambassador Don Mackay from New Zealand, and his style of facilitation proved to be very effective, and in later stages he was brought in to chair the ad hoc committee as well. So I don't know if that helps. Yeah,
I know that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, again, there are a lot of things coming through here. I mean, many things that are beyond your control, but actually it's really good to understand the different things that do influence the outcome. One of the other questions that was posed was about member state champions, and you've already pointed to the critical role that Mexico played. But Ferdis, perhaps it'd be good to hear from you about whether member state champions played a significant role in achieving the general recommendation.
Yeah, and I lost the page. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So then, I mean, I would like to respond to Francis Januddin's question about about who led the working group. Actually, working group worked for drafting, negotiation, and I led the working group, but we had two important meetings where we could mobilize the general opinion uh, for the for a general recommendation. I mean, one at the UN, that is we have presented a concept note, and another at the Geneva, lunch meeting. Those two meetings are very crucial. And we internally, we had several meetings from 2008 to 2010. We have many meetings, during our session. And we have drafted, several, the draft general recommendation and changed one after another. In 2010, we made a final one, and the UN had accepted that. So that was the great, news for the older women as well. I don't have the page. How can I get the page?
Sorry, you don't have what? Sorry.
Linear page has gone from my computer, but I
Uh,
can.
that's okay. As long as you can hear us, that's the most important thing. Don't
Okay.
worry. That's fine. And
And
so,
LGBT, this is really unfortunate. LGBT older women, they
yes.
also need support. I need to get support from this general recommendation. And civil society members and NGOs need to raise questions regarding the situation of LGBT older women, uh, to raise their questions and to have a binding obligation by the states parties. I think.
So that I think there was a very specific question actually asked by one of our members, by Vijay and Naradu from DMOA in Mauritius, who wanted to understand, who did highlight the fact that right now there's still many challenges that older LGBTI women are facing. And that they're experiencing, they don't have financial support, or they're even they sometimes are extremely isolated socially from in the community. So what more do you think should happen in terms of can happen to support them with respect to the kind of the recommendation? What more should CEDAW be doing around this?
I think more awareness about the LGBT older women's rights is very important at the UN and at the national level, because we need to support, we need to respect that Tina has already said, to each and everyone's desire and everyone's choice.
Thank you. So for both of you, and I'll turn first to Tina and then come back to you, Ferdis. Cynthia Stewart has asked the question about the role that the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and National Human Rights institutions played. So how critical was their role in getting to the end results that you both achieved? Tina, you first.
The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights played an important role during the process, at times writing background papers. For instance, I think even before the negotiations, they had written some papers showing what were the gaps in international human rights law to show why a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities was needed, and talking about also a twin track approach that I believe in is the same as what's happening with the rights of older people. They issued a background paper at one point on legal capacity to inform the member states about exactly what the state of international law was on that issue. So I think they did play a role in, you know, coming in as human rights experts and supporting the progressive development of norms in this area. Critically, after the convention, the OHCHR has played a really important role in putting out different kinds of guidance reports, supporting the different expert mechanisms, the special rapporteurs, and supporting the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in applying the convention, particularly some of the more groundbreaking norms. I think the NHRIs, were important. I think they played a role. It's hard for me to actually say. They certainly played a role. I think that the disabled people's organizations were much more important than the NHRIs in that process, in terms of bringing out the content of what was needed, and we were able to formulate our human rights issues in ways that fit within international law. And the NHRIs were working pretty closely with us during most of that time. I think some of them also played a role, or some individual experts also played a role behind the scenes in advising some of the state delegations that we're leading. So there's probably a lot I'm not aware of in that regard.
That's really helpful, and we have just about 5-7 minutes left. There's 3 questions, but I want to just, again, there's one specific question to you, Tina, and then I'll go back to Ferdis, which is about the actual work that you did within the caucus. Was all the work done in English? And what was, I mean, this is probably very hard to answer concisely, but the question this is from Jean Bank, is how did your groups agree on definitions that were included in the text? So if you can give a very short answer to a very long answer required.
Yeah, the English was the working language of the ad hoc committee and of the IDC. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this was a disadvantage for everyone for whom English was not a first language, and from all the countries, the vast number of countries for whom English is not the first language. But that was the working language of the ad hoc committee and of the IDC. We had substantial participation from Latin America, of both states and civil society. So in that was a language grouping that was able to work together in their own language and also relate, to the IDC. How definitions actually came into the text at a very late stage in the negotiations, and it was even controversial as to whether to have a definition of people with disabilities. So I would just say we worked on that the same as we worked on any other issue, based on, win-win, trying to get everybody's needs met in the text.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Ferdis, I want to pose the same question to you, if I could, about the role that the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the National Human Rights Institutions played in the negotiating the text and achieving the result.
Yeah, we are very lucky that we got support from the Office or the High Commissioner of Human Rights and they are very much supportive to us, especially Ms. John Connors. She all the time she supported the committee, the drafting committee, and we got all important inputs also from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as well. And older women's issue is a genuine issue. It is a problem that is very much alive. So that is why, and we are women, we are getting older, and we need to do something for us. That was the main, urge from everybody. That is why we needed a general recommendation, so that older women's rights are protected. And everybody, sincerely, they were from all over the world. I think about 180 NGOs they were with us, and we got support. During the session and in between the session, everybody was connected to me. And they sent all the inputs which need to be included in the general recommendation, and we drafted the general recommendation repeatedly. So many times, each and every time, so that to make it a very perfect one.
Thank you. So one thing I haven't heard either of you say or speak about is the role that human rights NGOs played in either of your processes. And I was wondering if you, just very briefly, if you could just reflect, because they may have played a positive role, but they also might have played a negative role in terms of the development. So Fergus, you first, is there anything, were they present? Were they active? Do you think they played a constructive role?
Yeah, because the NGOs worked with me. They were very much positive. I have mentioned in my paper in the beginning that Susan Somers, Bridget Sleep, and and many other NGOs, from different organizations, they said that they tried to include the older women's rights in the CEDAW general recommendation for 10 years, but couldn't do that. So that is why when they got me as a CEDAW committee member interested to do something for older women, they supported me wholeheartedly.
Thank you. And
And
Tina, and yeah, sorry, please.
they also supported some resources as well, in the Geneva for lunchtime meetings, for brown bag lunch, So NGOs from New York, they supported me in this respect. Also, they supported two experts to go to Geneva to attend the meeting. So all these are very great help and positive support for the general recommendation.
Thank you very much, and Tina, the same to you. And I suppose perhaps and for this, you did answer the question perfectly, but maybe also just to reflect a little bit on the NGOs, the human rights organizations that are not specific to disability rights per se, but who work and are present within the human rights community. Because that's, I think, a key thing for us is relating and thinking about how do we relate to this wider community of stakeholders. And I'm just interested in what role did they play within achieving CRPD?
Okay, so we have the DPOs, which are the primary organizations that are fighting for our own human rights. We have NGOs that are human rights focused, working within the disability community, NGOs that are development focused, working within the disability community. Those are the ones I've already been talking about pretty much as allied NGOs. In terms of the more conventionally known human rights organizations, Amnesty International attended some of the meetings of the ad hoc committee. I think Human Rights Watch did. I'm not sure. Human Rights Watch might not have. Human Rights Watch subsequently has really taken on CRPD and disability rights in a big way, but I don't actually think they were present in the negotiations. I believe that they were taking a kind of wait and see role, both Human Rights Watch and to a lesser extent, Amnesty. And then somehow afterwards, it seems to be reversed, where I don't see Amnesty getting involved, you know, at this point, and Human Rights Watch is involved in a big way. So I would say it was really, our process was really led by the constituency, and the human rights organizations were sitting on the sidelines.
That's really helpful. So one very quick question and one question that is also quick but longer to say. So for the first quick question to you, Tina, is were there specific objections that states raised to having CRPD? So where was the initial opposition coming from? And if you could just briefly give some of those arguments.
One of the issues was no new rights coming from the European Union, and a fear of cost, especially a fear of international cooperation. And we actually, the whole issue of no new rights, we dealt with that really decisively in the working group, in a way that really satisfied the NGOs, because no, we don't want any special rights. We want the same rights as everybody else. So it was all about equal basis with others, non-discrimination, and that was the perfect solution.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. That's really helpful and very concise. So the final question is raised by Jane Barrett, and I think is particularly important where we are today, which is that because in the context where this next session of the open-ended working group has been cancelled because of COVID-19, are there one or two actions that you as our speakers would recommend that we as GAROP members take in civil society larger can do in response? What should we do now? Because we will not have our next session, our next discussion. So what one or two things do you think we should do to mobilize right now? Tina, you first and then Fergus.
You know, every process is different. I would say from my experience, what would be my instinct would be, you know, to have open forums. I know a lot of this has been done on a countrywide basis, but I would be interested to, and maybe GAROP is already doing it, but to really talk amongst ourselves and talk about what are the issues, what are the things we really want to see in a convention. That's my bias. That's where I'm always going to go, and I just don't have the experience or the inclination to do the other aspect of how to mobilize states. So maybe Fergus has that, or someone else has that aspect.
Thanks so much for that, Tina. And Fergus.
Yeah, I think you need some dedicated and committed people within the UN system to support the causes of human rights. And also you need to have some, whole group who are supporting you for this. Everybody is working for the same causes, you know. That is the strength of the whole movement. I think it happened in our case. And also we got the support of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's a great support, and always they are in our side. So though we have some opposition from European Union, but older women's causes and older women's rights have, got the GR.
Thank you so much. And this neatly brings us to the end of the webinar. I just have a few final comments to make before wrapping up. First, just a huge thanks to our speakers for the richness and the experience and the intelligence and the wisdom that you've shared with us. You've given us an enormous amount to think about, and certainly a huge help in our collective efforts to achieve a greater protection for the rights of older persons and hopefully specifically a convention. Reflecting on this next step issue, I think one of the key things that we certainly are very mindful of as GAROP is the fact that while the UN meets in New York and Geneva to discuss these issues, decisions actually are getting made at Capitol. And this is the role that we have to play as members of GAROP, is to make sure that we bring this discussion, make sure that there is coordination, make sure that different parts of government are aware of this agenda and are acting. So what we do next in response to the cancellation of the session is we do not let governments forget that actually this agenda is still very much alive. We will be offering suggestions from the Secretariat of actions and things that can be done. A critical importance of things that have to happen right now are influencing the ongoing negotiations on the recommendations, the negotiated recommendations. This is not closed yet, and it is of critical importance that member states agree these recommendations by consensus so we can get this process firmly embedded in the work of the open-ended working group. And then the next step is for us to get civil society involved and included in the process in the same way that they were at the outset of CRPD. So please, if you have the capacity to engage with your governments about this, you can get plenty of resources and information on the GAROP website. The Secretariat, Ellen, has been sending out information to you, so please look out for those emails. And also, please use the new members-only space for GAROP members. This is where we will be able to maintain and develop discussions that which allows us to develop and take our strategic thinking forward more effectively. And then finally, just a huge thank you to IFA for hosting this webinar. And your support has been invaluable in making these connections happen through these webinars. And also a shout out to say that the IFA conference in 2020, which is going to be happening in November, is going to have a specific focus on human rights and the rights of older persons. And it will be a key place where some of these discussions can be taken forward as well. So with this, we bring the webinar to a close. Thank you very much, everyone. This webinar is now closed.